Hi, good evening. I'm Michelle White, Senior Curator at the Menil, and I'm so glad you're joining us this evening. Tonight, we'll be in discussion with Alora and Calzadilla on the exhibition Spectres of Noon. Before I get started, I'd really love for you to send in your questions. You can submit them this evening by emailing programs@menil.org. They'll be coming up on my feed, and we're hoping to take them throughout the talk. So I'd love to introduce Jennifer and Guillermo joining us tonight from Puerto Rico. Hello.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Before I introduce you formally, will you tell us where you are right now?
We're in Culebra, Puerto Rico. It's a small little island. So yeah, there may be bad reception.
But we're doing our best to stay connected.
Our best to be here connected.
It looks good. Welcome. So I wanted to introduce you before we started. Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla. So since 1995, the artists have been working together collaboratively on a practice that's really been defined by research and work that really responds critically to the intersection between culture, history, geopolitics, and so many other subjects that this exhibition especially brings up. They're also known for producing works that combine performance, sculpture, sound, video, and photography, and also always working with very unique materials. Just in this show alone, it's everything from recycled plastics and cast bronze to the crowd pleaser, bat guano, and we'll get to that later. They have had major solo exhibitions around the world, recently at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Maxi Museum of 21st Century Art in Rome, the Dia Art Foundation, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In 2011, they represented the United States at the Venice Biennale. So I'm about to show a video just to orientate everyone here to the exhibition. For those of you who haven't seen it, it opened about a month ago. And what you'll see in the video is that Jennifer and Guillermo have conceived of 7 major new works for this presentation. They have spent about the past 4 years kind of coming to visit the Menil in Houston and have really drawn inspiration from the museum's holdings of surrealist art, from our archive collection, and also really thinking about the connections between Houston and their home in Puerto Rico, which of course connects us sort of through the Gulf of Mexico and sort of combines everything from energy commerce to climate catastrophe. So all of the works on view in this exhibition revolve around the theme of midday. Everything revolves around noon, that moment when the sun's at its highest, when it splits the day in two, and the moment when shadows disappear and demons emerge. And for the artist, this idea of light and sun and the moment when the sun's at its zenith really provides this ultimate platform to discuss our contemporary moment. I'll also say when you're about to watch this short video, a musical score by David Lang permeates the exhibition and really augments the hypnotic atmosphere of disorientation that the artist presents in this exhibition.
August, autumn. Mid-back, mid-brain, mid-bridge, mid-calf,
Thank you. So hopefully that gave you a sneak peek of the exhibition if you haven't seen it. And I will say it will run through the end of June 2021. So for any of you not in Houston right now, you definitely have time to plan a trip. So Jennifer and Guillermo, thank you for being here. I think this is quite appropriate for us to be having a conversation this way because this is pretty much how we installed the exhibition.
Yes.
And I wanted to start, like, as you know, we installed the show with the artists in far away in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to start with this idea of what the show does in terms of sort of evoking this particular atmosphere and mood. I think something that's really captured nicely in that video we watched. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you wanted all of the works to kind of interact and create an experience.
Yes, for sure, we were thinking about this idea of a kind of landscape, and I think that was both in terms of the installation and also as far as a exhibition theme. You know, the theme of Midday itself is tied to a relationship to a landscape and a mood that is brought upon you in a landscape when the sun is at its zenith, right? Like you talked about in your introduction. So we were thinking about this landscape metaphor in the installation and the conception of the exhibition, and it being this kind of delirious state that we were trying to get after, that we were really interested in the concept of noon, this idea that at noon is this moment when you sort of lose your bearings, you fall into this state of torpor, you almost get into the state of wanting to fall asleep. But in that weird moment, this strange moment, there's a lot of potentiality there to encounter unlikely things. And I think the exhibition itself is the kind of encounter that we were trying to stage with these different objects that come together in real time and space to create an experience that for us is metaphor for noon.
And okay, so we started working together on this project about 4 years ago. And maybe we could start with like where you started. Like you were here in Houston, you were visiting the Minnow. Like, what do you think was the like kernel of an idea that sort of helped kind of spark what became this presentation of your work?
Well, there was this text by Roger Caillois that we read over a decade ago.
No, 2 decades ago.
Yeah,
A long time ago.
a long time ago. Yeah. And I remember both of us really finding the text incredible. It's very short text.
It's called The Noon Complex.
It's called The Noon Complex.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I remember at that time being like, wow, you know, when you fall in love with something that is such a intense, you know, idea. And normally those things wither away with time, you know, but encountering that text again as we were doing research on the archives of the museum, you know, we find the actual documents where the text was published for the first time in the Minotaur journal. And reading that text again, I remember feeling like, wow, this holds something that for us personally had a force. There's something about that text. And that was, I think, the beginning of the journey for this exhibition.
Definitely an important point of departure. I'd also add that just visiting the collection was such an impressive experience, to be in that amazing space, and spaces actually, not just even the main building, but all of the other buildings on the Menil campus, and the incredible collection that is the Menil. Really deeply inspired us, I would say. And then we had that amazing opportunity to visit your famous treasure rooms, where there's this incredible archive of material history, all these amazing treasures, truly treasures that are there, and deeply inspiring. And the way that they're sort of categorized too, that I remember strongly, like the impression of going into the room that was like the Byzantine room, and you see these kind of like icon paintings, and then there's another room that has artifacts from Oceania and Africa. And so you kind of get this sense of like this world that the Menils, I think, were trying to create. Again, an idea of bringing together all of these diverse things from all around the world and creating a world in and of itself, which is the collection. And we were really taken by that, I think, experience, and wanted to respond to, I think, a little bit about what we understand to be what the Menils were actually trying to get at in their own practice as collectors in some way. And after then going back and learning more about their own history as collectors and their fascinating biography, there were themes that just resonated with ourselves too, that we felt like this was an important and fortuitous opportunity to explore. Among them being the idea of the sacred. That idea was something that we really found deeply fascinating. And I think one of the things or qualities that we were trying to, conditions that we were trying to create in the exhibition was some sense of the sacred in this exhibition, even as the objects that make it are very unlikely objects, for such a pursuit.
I mean, could we pull out one work in the exhibition that you think sort of touches on this idea of the sacred?
I think it's I kind of think all of them do, but I mean, in a way, like the engines of Manifest are these kind of totems to me, like these big, they're like, they remind me in some way of like a totem, or of of a kind of one of these, and the way that you relate to it in a sense of scale, the awe, the simple scale of this thing on the wall, it kind of conjures, I think, something in our cultural memory of like that positioning of looking up at something that is bigger than you and kind of taking it in is somehow, right, a condition of that experience that we might associate with a feeling for the sacred. It doesn't always have to be big or grandiose, but certainly there are ways that you can kind of trigger, I think, those feelings through a certain type of formal approach. But then again, that said, then there's obviously, we're always playing, and just like the theme of the show is how midday itself, we think of as this kind of hinge that hinges both, practically speaking, right, the morning and the night, the two parts of the day. So it's that moment, that very, very precise razor thin moment when rise and decline are at its apex. So it's able to at the same time hold together opposing things. So in the example of Manifest, you have something that kind of evokes a feeling of something sacred, but at the same time is made out of something quite debased. It's made out of fat and bird excrement. So there is a kind of, displacement of your, materialities that kind of then challenge maybe that first reading that you might have of, your experience of looking at an object.
Right. I mean, and it's also like in contradistinction to this like use of like bronze, which is such a sort of refined, sparkling, shiny material, but both kind of this equal sense of awe that I think is both spiritual, but also, has such sort of significant ties to the sort of legacies of surrealism that you're pulling from.
I might add too, when you mentioned that, it reminded me that one of the reasons why we chose to cast the transformer in bronze, particularly, was because we were thinking about the tradition of the relic, and particularly the religious relic. And we had this amazing experience that I won't ever forget. We once visited the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and in one of the rooms, it was such an incredible impression. We walked through and there was a big line, and we didn't know what everyone was queuing up to see. And there's a small display case, and in it are two objects. One is like a piece of earth, I guess, essentially, that had been taken from the ground that has the footprint of Muhammad, the step of his footprint, the physical impression of Muhammad's footstep. And next to it is the right arm of St. John the Baptist. And it's the arm of, which he, of course, used to, baptize Christ. And it's this arm of St. John the Baptist that's all cast in bronze with a little window right where the cephalic vein would be, and showing, that's where you can see the actual relic bones. And we were fascinated by reliquary and the presence that this thing had, as much for what it showed as for what it didn't show, what it revealed and what it didn't reveal. And of course, then the material of bronze as this thing to kind of encase this important object that matters, right? Historically and spiritually and culturally and so on. And we thought of the transformer in a way as a kind of relic of our times, of our culture. It's this thing that also is, it's not, by no means am I trying to say that it has any comparison per se with the hand of St. John the Baptist, but there is something that you can kind of draw an analogy about what are the things that we, in our contemporary, let's say, capitalist culture also, worship. And certainly I think the production and the transmission of energy is definitely one of those things. And so we were playing with that idea somehow, with that object, blackout.
Also, the sound component of the work has this, it's almost like this meditative, the main home sound. It sounds almost like a mantra, or like this sort of sound that may help you reach a level of focus and concentration, right? That this home, this sound that also adds to the word this strange quality of, I don't want to say
meditation, the meditative state somehow can be evoked by the sound of this industrial object.
But at the same time, the thing is not, it's not dead, but it's not alive neither. Somehow in between, right? It's vibrant. It's vibrant. It's not alive because it's not performing its function. It's not transmitting electricity, but it's not dead neither because it's sort of like producing this sound, right? That is anchored to the space of Houston and the gallery.
And I would also I think when you're talking about spirituality and my experience of being in this show, I think, as you're pulling from, say, Byzantine references or icons, you do such an amazing job kind of conflating form and content, right? And you do that materially, like the materials you use and the choices you make about materials are so important. And I feel like carry just as much weight as, say, what you're representing, or in the show, what you're, casting or replicating.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all very deliberate choices, and we really think about materials as being these carriers of very complex histories and meanings and ideas, as much as being just physical things that also occupy space and time. And it's really interesting to us how you can really work with those different aspects of a material to conjure both a physical, phenomenological, sensational experience as much as an intellectual one that can help you open up kind of portals to thought as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the works, also they're doing these mysterious things, like for example the engines, they function as sound panels. There's an acoustic quality to one of that we found fascinating. It was one of the reasons why we used the material, in addition to other references, historical and political. But in terms of practical, there is something about acoustically about the work that we like, that it absorbs the sound in the space, right?
So there's this dialogue too then between two objects, blackout, which is producing the sound of energy or electricity, and then the engines, which are through its organic materiality, is absorbing those sound waves and absorbing that. So there's a real process that's happening in the gallery that's not a representation, but it's actually a what do you call it, performance of real phenomena that are happening, while at the same time they're also meaning other things. So I mean, we like this kind of density that you can create in artwork, where you can really layer things, and you can obviously just respond to them on a very initial way, but you could also go deep into them and find, hopefully, if it's crafted really well, lots of other deeper meanings in them. Like I think the objects in the Menil collection, again, also have. That's, again, what we were attracted to. I mean, so many objects in the treasure rooms are so mysterious, and I think their mystery comes precisely from that same saturation to somehow get there in our own work through the show.
And I also find that in this work, so say with the big ship engines, and we're talking about the ship engines you see on the screen in the background here, you're so pulled in because you're sort of examining the substance. I mean, we're literally dealing with sort of materials on a granular level, like these little sort of dried pieces of poop, right? But then you're also sort of pulled back at this sort of massive scale of this object, and it almost to me works how your mind works and how you guys are making art, where you're sometimes seeing very sort of specific moments in history or specific sort of political situations in Puerto Rico on this island, just sort of blowing them up, sort of pulling them back in, and I think it works materially so beautifully. And here's another nice shot showing the great scale of Manifest. Could you talk a little bit about your decision to use guano in this work? Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Again, it has, obviously, there's many references that we were drawing upon to make this work. But particularly one that was important was, as you mentioned, us being based in Puerto Rico, we're also thinking through our own conditions of living in Puerto Rico and the kind of daily questions that one confronts living here that have to do with the particular social political arrangement that Puerto Rico has with the United States. And so it's a question that even right now, as we're coming up on an election, is at the forefront of most conversations, actually, about the status of Puerto Rico and what it means to be an unincorporated territory of the United States. And it's something that is a very complex and history. But in that history that we are referencing in this work, it's a very long story. It's kind of hard to even synthesize it in a short answer. But I guess the main point that I would say is that we learned that how do I begin the story?
There's two main points, right? There's the Guano Island Act.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the first thing. So we're going to say, how did Puerto Rico become a territory of the United States and have the status that it does, which is not a state, but is an unincorporated territory? Well, its history comes from the 19th century, during the time of Manifest Destiny, when the United States was expanding, looking for expanding its territory, but also kind of becoming a world power, really, a trade power. And one of the big, believe it or not, sources of economic growth and sort of prosperity among the competing countries, England, the Dutch, and so on, was access to fertilizer to fertilize crops. And it turned out that guano was a very important fertilizer in that time. In fact, it was like gold, essentially. It was such an important, it would be like in our times, what is it called? The material that they use for the cell phones. We all need to have access to. It's this kind of very important, material that society wouldn't be able to function without. And what happened was that the United States decided to pass an act, a congressional act of 1856 that was called the Guano Islands Act. And what it did was it gave permission to any U.S. citizen who found an island that wanted it, had guano nuts on it, to claim it as territory of the United States. But of course, since the islands didn't have any humans living there, people living there, it became part of the United States as an unincorporated territory. Because there was obviously no path to statehood that would need to be deliberated for the bats or the birds. So it became a way to legally acquire land for this purpose. And it then, during the after the U.S. Had acquired Puerto Rico essentially as a spoil of the Spanish-American War in 1898. During the first decade of the 20th century, there was a series of, it's very interesting actually considering what's happening now, a series of Supreme Court cases, in fact, and it was a very conservative and very racist court that made a series of decisions at that time that had to do specifically with the status of Puerto Rico. And one of the judges invoked this Guano Islands Act as the argument for why Puerto Rico could remain an insular island, an island that is not going to be incorporated into the body of the United States, which is something that actually is against the Constitution, because the Constitution says that every territory, with people in it that the U.S. expands to, those people automatically become part of the United States. So this question about belonging to, but not fully participating in, the process of becoming part of the U.S. was sort of played out over this reference to, or kind of in the context of something that started with, mining bird and bat excrement. If I can sort of summarize it in a short way.
It's such an incredible history, and I'll make a shout. We're publishing a catalog for this show, and we're working with an amazing scholar, Daniel Immenwar, who specializes in American imperialism and guano, and he's written for us, and it's a pretty incredible history. And could you talk about? I mean, this is very typical of your work, where you're diving in extremely deep to into your research, from kind of religious sources in the 4th century to 19th century legislation. And I'm wondering if you could take a moment just to talk about your process in general and how you work to conceive a work, not only together as two people, but in terms of using research to ignite that conversation and idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's two of us, so there is. We like to use the word saturation in the way that we craft the work. There is layers and layers and layers. And in a way, we research them extremely methodically, and we write about them, and they, in a way, is what constitutes what the work is. For example, like titling the work of the engines, manifest, referring to, obviously, like from Manifest Destiny to Manifest being the
cargo and the content of the ship.
The contents of the ship in a cargo, and the engines being of the boat, the boat brings.
But I want to add something that's important, I think, to explain at this point is what we also really love, though, is sort of like the intersections and the kind of like cross references. So while we were thinking and like how research, maybe because we're two, and maybe because we have this kind of dynamic methodology, not alone, things intersect. So in this case, we were like doing that and learning and diving deep into that history and getting really interested in all those fascinating stories about the relationship between Puerto Rico and U.S. At the same time, we were looking into thinking about this exhibition, the history of surrealism, and we wanted to kind of ground that in the movement of the surrealists through the Caribbean, because there's a fascinating, also very rich history there. And something that came up that we really kind of anchored into is that there was a group of surrealists and other intellectuals who fled Europe in the Second World War, at the beginning of the Second World War, and they all left on a cargo ship. And they they were, to Martinique. And then at that point, then this amazing encounter happens, which we can talk about later as another work in the show. But for the manifest, in both kind of, indexing both the Guano Islands Act, Manifest Destiny,
The Jones Act.
but also it's somehow the people who were on this other boat, that cargo boat, like this is a cargo boat engine, that were coming through the Caribbean and bringing a whole other kind of incredible history that then unfolds as a result of this fascinating encounter.
And we have this really interesting document that we gathered in the National Library in Martinique.
Mhm.
And when we went there to do research about, the survivors in Martinique when they arrived in the 1940s, that it was the manifest
Of the boat.
document of the boat. And in that case, it says, when Breton and Wilfredo Lam and,
Claude Lévi-Strauss.
where did
and
they came, where did they stop? It's the entire sort of history of their journey and everyone who was there. So it was
a fascinating
archive.
And
But
I
also,
just
want to
want
say
to.
that even though,
Go ahead, Michelle.
Oh no, sorry. I just wanted to stop for a minute as we're talking about Martinique and the boat to take a moment and sort of refer to a specific work in the show that addresses this, and that's the projection piece Penumbra that's on the back wall of the second gallery. And so this is, you can see it behind the tree, an animation of foliage from the island of Martinique where this boat landed in the early 1940s.
right? So, I mean, when we went there to, there's this incredible story of these mythical hikes that, Wilfredo Lam and André Breton took with Aimé Césaire to some incredible poets and, intellectuals in Martinique. And they took these mythical hikes in this forest in Martinique in the 1940s that, and we just basically went there to do the same hike, try to find the same trail, and got interested in the forest itself. And we were in contact with the Department of Natural History in the forest, and were able to get a list of all the different species of plants, that in there, and created this very complicated
Digital
reconstruction of the entire forest with the trees and everything, where these guys did this hike in the 1940s. And basically what you're seeing is that the shadow moving through the space at the Menil, following the sun path of the sun in real time in Houston. So there's this beautiful thing in which the shadows from a forest in a different place converge with the actual shadows of Houston that are going through the skylight of the architecture and coming through the windows of the space. So there's this convergence of times and places and
light and shadow.
Lights and shadows. Also, that work has this other component to it. Speaking of layers and saturation, that is a recording that our friend and composer David Lang found of sounds in that forest, and he was able to use that to construct this soundtrack of the piece, which was there's this incredible Italian violin player, Tartini, which, by the way, he made this famous piece called the Devil's Sonata. And speaking of devils and and the demon and the noonday demon, which is the synonym for Assyria. He developed this methodology of that are called combination tones, which are it's an encounter of two tones. Just when one tone and a second tone meet and create a third tone. So what you're listening to is the result of two tones that create, it's almost like a shadow. So he used violins to create this soundtrack, I guess, as a nod to Tartini, that somehow loosely generates the sound of this recording in the forest of Martinique. I don't know if I explained it. It's very complicated.
This
But very subtle, I think.
Yeah.
Probably you probably, many people probably don't even notice that it's there. They might even think it's just the shadows from the outside somehow.
Yeah.
So it's, it's very subtle things at the same time.
It is so like subtle, but also in the subtlety, because often people will come in and not notice it. And I mean, it depends on the time of day. It's on an 8-hour cycle, so it's constantly changing. But I wanted to talk to you about that because it's so subtle that it's incredibly convincing. And this idea of, especially in the show, this idea of replication of nature. We haven't talked about the tree yet, which you can see here in this image. This is a tree cast in compressed coal. And then if we go back, the idea of the transformer being cast in copper. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of replication and convincing replication that we find throughout this presentation?
Yeah, there are several works that involve casting things from reality, right? So we have the engines that are cast, the transformer, and then this tree that you see here, which is a species of a Scots pine tree that we selected for its symbolic value, referencing an event that we, again, found to be fascinating and kind of inspiring for this sort of world that we were trying to landscape, or world that we were creating. The tree suggests a form similar to the tree that had fallen over in the forests of France, in a region called Montignac, France, where a tree, a similar type of tree, had fallen over, again, 1940, around the same time, a year before the Surrealists had left for Martinique. This tree had fallen over in a forest, and having fallen over, it had opened up the roots that were in the ground, had opened up an opening or a path in the earth, and it turned out that opening, a group of young boys were, walking through this forest with their dog, and they had come across this fallen tree, and in that opening was the entrance to the caves of Lascaux. So, that incredible, again, other world that we now know as this world of what we call now prehistory, what only became revealed by this sort of fortuitous act of nature, right? Like this storm had just blown this tree over, and if that hadn't happened, that would have never been discovered. And so there's this amazing, chance also thing that has happened, and of course.
And then you also have with this tree,
in a way. Go ahead.
Sorry, the way this tree then sort of the themes of light and energy and electricity come into this tree so profoundly.
Yeah. So then we were thinking about materials again, right? So we were like, well, what do we want to cast this tree out of? We want to bring this tree into the exhibition.
Well, this tree, something interesting is that it was hit by lightning. So you have the splitting of the lightning, the actual tree index on the object itself. And it's the same species of tree, about the same size, and source in, the same area where this older tree in 1940s fell over as a result of a storm and revealed this prehistoric moment, which, interestingly enough, there's this convergence between, at that time, discovering Lascaux, and as Bataille talks about it, like, the beginning of humanity with the phantom, or the spectrum of the end of humanity, being World War II and
the atomic bomb.
So that's an interesting, really incredible moment when you see these opposite forces, right? Speaking of like midday and division and splitting, you encounter, the beginning of humanity with the end of humanity.
And then back to the materiality and the casting and the choice of these materials and why this casting. So to speak towards the material, we thought of coal because coal is essentially
buried sunlight.
It's where what coal is our plants, trees that have millions of years ago absorbed the light of the sun, so had experienced midday themselves, died, and then had been for eons buried deep underground until they are then extracted for for energy purposes, but that coal itself is a materialization of light, essentially, and it's light converted into energy, or held as this potential energy that's in this material. And that's such a fascinating thing, I think, to think about, like how we can even grasp something like that. Like, how do we even imagine that type of scale of time? It's kind of beyond our human abilities to really think what happened millions of years ago, and think about that living thing had felt the sunlight and had absorbed it and had lived and died at that moment. So there's something really, again, profound about the material itself that we wanted to bring into this context of this sculpture that references another kind of moment of awe, which was the moment of discovering this other moment not so long ago in the deep past, but still quite long ago. Lesko, I would say, is pretty far in the past too, and also unimaginable, I think. And that's what also is so fascinating about what we call now prehistory, is the kind of freshness of it too. Like the drawings, like were commented by Bertai, they seem so new and fresh. They seem like they were made yesterday. They don't feel like something that's 40,000 years old. It feels like it could have been done last week. And so this kind of compression and expansion of time that both the Cave of Lascaux represents, what coal represents as a material, and what we're trying to get at with this idea of midday, because midday for us, as we looked into this subject matter, what's really fascinating about it is this kind of weird vortex of time itself, where it kind of is in this moment where time stretches both towards the future and to the past, and kind of affects both things. So all of those things combined seem to be like a very good fit. They all kind of fit together conceptually, I guess I would say.
I mean, it's how, like, being with you so much, I have to say, it's like how your brains work, like how you just swing through these temporal terrains from prehistory to, contemporary political concerns now. And we haven't talked about this other big theme that, of course, relates to noon and light is this concept of acedia that's also so critical to understanding this exhibition.
Mm. Yeah, well, again, when we started in the library of the Menil and we encountered the Calwa text, which is a short text, it's like a 2-page synthesis of the history of the idea of the noonday, the noon complex, which then he then describes this other term, which is the noon.
Okay, well, they are on an island in Puerto Rico, so I'm so sorry for the disruption. Let's see if they.
No, elaborating on what Jennifer was saying, like the noonday demon is the synonym for acedia, which is this spirit, this sort of specter that appears at midday. And one of the qualities or attributes that it performs on its, on its subjects is that it makes the present intolerable and the future impossible to imagine. Acedia, in a way, to say it simply, means lack of care, not caring towards the world, not caring towards others, or to oneself. We found in this idea, in this concept of acedia, a strange echo with the present.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredible. I mean, this discourse around acedia, as it's even been evolving since the pandemic, is pretty extraordinary. And could we talk a little bit about graft? Because I feel like a graft is one of those pieces that really beautifully kind of represents this idea of stasis and this ascetic condition, the metaphor of now.
Yeah, well, I guess, it's this idea of a sort of phantom blossoming of a tree that's not there. So you're having this experience of seeing the blossoms of a tree that you might find in the spring, or, I don't know what time of year specifically in Houston, but most likely this late winter, early spring, you would have trees coming into bloom, and then there would be this cycle when the blossoms fall off, and then there's a beautiful moment when they're on the ground, and then they go and germinate and they become trees elsewhere. They become part of the soil and the ground and whatnot, and provide nutrients to the earth itself. But in this case, this is all kind of frozen in this sort of state of, again, plasticity. And by that, I mean like a kind of inertia. It's not going anywhere. It's that state, that state which is temporal or ephemeral has now been extended. It's a well. It's like eternal now. Now that moment has now become eternal, and it's never going to move in either direction. So it's this kind of stasis that now it's in, and it happens again to the materiality of, if they were real blossoms, they would obviously go through their natural cycle and they would rot and they would disappear. But because we made them out of material that is artificial, synthetic, it actually holds that plasticity of that moment into an indefinite temporality. So that was the idea behind why we chose that material and those flowers. And of course, the flowers themselves are a type of species of tree that are native to the Caribbean. You find them throughout and also in South America. There's a pink version that is more common to Puerto Rico or endemic to Puerto Rico, but the yellow version is also common. It was imported or brought in a long time ago, and it's kind of just as common in terms of seeing it in the landscape. But both, nevertheless, are the tree itself. The species is endemic to the Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and it was a type of wood that during the colonial period was very valuable. And so it really was, it's a kind of example of a tree that has a very functional, or had a very, it was an important resource basically for the colonial period. So it was like one of the things that were extracted from the Caribbean in the colonial period was lumber or timber. So this tree kind of represents that also, that relationship, that kind of history of colonialism, and why colonialism, what were the means of colonialism, and basically colonialism is always built on extraction and exploitation and taking resources, and so this tree somehow indexes that history.
And it makes that connection between, it makes the point that one of the primary legacies of colonialism is deforestation.
True.
This is one of the reasons that we use this particular tree, because it's linked to that legacy and history and then the tree in danger of extinction, I guess that will be more obvious or common thing to do, right?
And I also maybe now should just say, because it's obvious it didn't come up yet, but we've been making these works over the last, like you mentioned, 4 years. And so 4 years ago was 2017, right? 16, and then 2017, we started in 2016 when we first met, and by 2017, we, living in Puerto Rico, had the experience of Hurricane Maria, and of course that was a major event, just like you had in Houston, Harvey, right? So we had these kind of climactic event also where these questions of the environment and ecology were kind of laid bare. One of the most, I think, striking visuals that kind of stuck in everyone's imagination after Maria was the way that the island had kind of been stripped bare, like all the foliage, all of the trees had been blown away. And so, and still to this day, actually, you still see the majority of the mountains, you can still see these like brown sticks, and that's basically the trunks of the trees. They still haven't fully, they're alive, but some aren't, but they haven't yet become this full, lush forest that they were prior to this event. And that, I think, also was something that we were reacting to in one way or another, this idea of these changes that are happening. I mean, of course, hurricanes are not unusual to the Caribbean. In fact, there's a very interesting history of the relationship between hurricanes and social movements, like the way in which these kind of climactic events have also led in history to social revolutions and social rights, and leading to further rights. And so there's this kind of idea too that maybe and I think that's what is being fought over right now in terms of the reconstruction of Puerto Rico, is about what kind of society can we build again now in the aftermath of this devastation. But going back, so one of the things too, as I was saying, I was looking at these forests. We noticed, we went actually, we went to meet the head of the forestry department at El Yunque, which is the national forest in the eastern part of Puerto Rico, Ariel Lugo, and he was giving us some orientation. Because that was the first thing we asked, like what does it mean for the Caribbean and for Puerto Rico, all of these events. And one of the things that we learned that we didn't know until having met him was that Puerto Rico is among a group of places in the world that amount to just 2.4% of the Earth's land surface, but that contains 60% of its diversity of plant life and flora and fauna. And they're called, kind of as a term that people kind of think about, the biodiversity hotspots. But this is an amazing idea that, this little island and the other islands of the Caribbean and other places across the planet, that is only 2.4% of the land surface of the Earth.
Wow.
This amount of diversity. And there's something really, again, sort of, marvelous and extraordinary and kind of unthinkable about that we were also wanting to respond to when we made this piece.
I mean, it is so extraordinary. As we've been working on this show, the hurricanes, and then, let's bring up the pandemic. I mean, it's certainly not something we would have expected. It sort of hugely factored into the installation of this show, the timing of the show. But I mean, I've been talking about the condition of acedia to visitors and giving tours of this exhibition. Like, what could be a better word to describe our current state?
Yeah, it seems. Yeah, well, I guess we should all do like the desert monks did and try to, get back to hard work, because we're out of it. We work hard. So we have our work cut out for us.
Don't worry, I've been working hard for you guys, I assure you. It's been crazy installing a show without you, the artist, and we're really excited for you to make it here soon.
And also, last thing to say about acedia that I thought was really also beautiful is learning about its role in, like you say, early Christianity. So there was these sins, and one of them was this sin of acedia. But then there's also the other right side of it. There's the what's the word? The virtues, right? And what's the opposite of acedia is joy. So the good thing to think about is that if you work through the process of what we're in, there should be, you prevail over this demon. There could be great joy on the other side. So that's a positive.
Like light in the dark.
Yeah.
Or the other way around.
Yeah.
Are you ready for some questions?
Sure.
Okay, so we have our first question. It's striking to hear you talk about the fascinating historical layers that have come into every work that you've done. Our audience is asking, do you view your practice within a particular legacy of narrative art? If so, do you see it as a critique of the contemporary art world's particular orientation to the present time?
Well, I think we definitely, let me take an example of one of the works in the exhibition, the painting, the work of Cadastre, which is this really long work that is made with electricity. That we have been very much interested in electricity as a medium. And of course, we know we have inherited all the legacies of artists that have worked with the medium, like from Dan Flavin, that he used the medium of electricity to make his work, to, for example, Barnett Newman, that, the Menil has this incredible painting that is called Anna's Light. And he used to talk about the vibrancy of his colors as wattage. He said that has a lot of wattage. That painting has a lot of wattage. So, in a way, we like to work with the field in which we, participate in. And in this case, in this work, the medium of the work is electricity. Electricity is what makes the forms, the shapes in the work. And the subject of the work is also electricity. So we feel that we're sort of in a dialogue, in a continued dialogue with these traditions and these interests. And I mean, how that relates to the present, in the work itself, what we like about this, the work, this exhibition, but I guess the works that we made in general, is that how they themselves are in the works itself. You have manifested all these complex series of things. Like in the work of Cadastre, you have this electricity, and the electricity is the electricity that we use in our studio, and that is linked to the power grid of the city, which opens up to a larger grid and stocks and a series of larger, more complex investments and things that somehow they're all manifest themselves in that moment in time when that work was produced and generated, that yield that particular shape and forms and lines and that sort of thing.
But yeah, I think we're constantly feel surrounded by the incredible contributions of what was made before us, and I think we want to have that conversation in our work all the time, and so I think we feel really, our friends are people like, Aimé Césaire and, like you say, Barnett Newman and Cy Twombly. Like we kind of feel like we're having this conversation when all these people are in our heads, or they're in our studio somehow, and we're talking with them through the work that we do. So I don't know, it feels really like there's this presence of all these other works and thought that has come before us that has somehow, encountered, or we're trying to talk with those other predecessors, like what they've done directly. Really, I think it feels really like our peers are, go far back in time.
Okay, so another question we have has to do with
it's very, surrealist, like we're doing our seance with them.
I mean, the way your brains work in that sort of a historic temporal space it's with you and in the work in such a profound way. So, we've talked a little bit about the soundscape as sort of contributing to this hypnotic atmosphere of the exhibition, but we have another question pertaining to that, dealing with the live vocal performances. And certainly when we started working on this show, the intention was to do live performances, and we've had to rethink that because we're in a global pandemic where choral groups and group singing is just not something we will be able to participate in that moment. But I'm wondering if you could briefly talk about what the hope is for the performances that we do hope to stage at the end of the exhibition, hopefully in the spring.
Absolutely. Guillermo, want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, these sound in the works are like a material component. It's not something that is added to, it's intrinsic from the outset of what the work is, I guess, as it will be form, shape, color, sound, or gravity. So sound is another material that makes up the work. In the case of the tree, for example, we worked with David, amazing David Lang, composer and friend, who just takes these journeys with us. And he developed the score for the piece of the tree based on the only human figure in the Lascaux cave drawings that is a mixture of a man and a bird. So the way that he structured the score, the live performance, is that there's two elements. One of them is sounds of bird songs, but slowed down to a really unrecognizable level, and a list that he made of divisions, that go in alphabetical order. and he structured that as a score that 5 vocalists are going to perform on the tree. That is it's a component of the work.
And uh, with Blackout, the other work that's in the exhibition, that piece, I mean, I think they're going to be extraordinary. It's going to be so exciting when there's the chance to do them live, because there's something about the, these very, one of the things that we like working with David is like, he's also into this kind of idea of like sort of testing the limits of what we understand to be what music is, or what it means to create like a possibility of like deep musical listening, what that means, like to really listen to things and really get pleasure out of understanding some very subtle, aspects of what it means to listen and what sound means. And so I think these works are really experimenting with this project of deep listening, trying to really listen and have an experience that isn't coming from a kind of conventional departure. And so it's great to work with David, because he is like, brilliant, and he has this, I think, vision that we also share that kind of is so complementary. And anyway, in Blackout, basically we had this idea for a long time that it was after, well, it actually first started before Maria. There was a blackout in Puerto Rico that happened in 2016. That was it lasted for a couple of weeks, and we were there when that happened. At that time, that seemed, outrageous, or not to have the power for 2 weeks. Of course, that was nothing in comparison to what happened after Maria, where the power was out in some places for up to a year. If you can imagine, that's just unheard of, but true. So we became really fascinated with again this idea of this electrical transformer and its sort of role that it plays in our society. We wanted to make a work that responded to and so we asked Dave, we wanted to make a work that, I should mention before this, just to sort of side, because all these things also, it's so crystal, there's like all these different layers, and it's hard to kind of just pull out one thread, and you feel like you're leaving out a lot of other backstory. And one of the backstories, of course, is in 2015, we made a work with Dia Art Foundation that was called Puerto Rican Light, where we got a work from Dan Flavin that he made in 1965 of the same name, and we put it in a cave in Puerto Rico. And the work was on view for several years in Puerto Rico in this cave. And the work consisted of the work of Dan Flavin in the cave that it was part of the Dia Offsite projects, basically. And you could come and, only 4 to 6 people were allowed to come at a time per day and go and travel.
It was powered with solar panels.
Anyway,
so when the sun rises, the light go on. When the sun sets, the light.
We do a lot of like conservation work to make that piece. Like if you want, maybe you could put the slide up of Puerto Rican.
Yeah, sure.
Cesar, if you can find it.
Yeah.
In order to make that happen, it took a lot of preparation. Among other things, we had to, do a huge environmental assessment of the cave to find out what ecological impact there would be of putting fluorescent light bulbs inside a natural setting where there are other flora and fauna that are protected, and we had to make sure that was not going to do any harm. Likewise, we had to do a big, extensive study of what it would mean to put these 3 fluorescent light bulbs that they don't even exist anymore. These kind of fluorescent light bulbs are basically they're obsolete because the technology has evolved, and so those bulbs are part of the Flavin work. I'm sure they're stockpiled and they're guarded for their rarity. And so we had to make sure that putting that object in the cave wouldn't do any damage to the artwork. And so we had to do all these different studies. And one of the studies that we happened to do in the process was, for some reason, we had done this recording, and we had a recording made.
I have to say, I didn't even know where you were going to go with this. I was your thread. I was
so
lost.
what happened was we were doing studies about the conservation and whatnot, and one of the reports they came back with this information that the sound that the light bulbs make is a B flat, and we're like, that's so interesting. So that's the sound of the bulbs. And when you're in the cave, which by the way, another kind of layer that you can find to contempt the show at the Menil is that the entire floor of that cave is covered in 3 feet or more bat guano. So the cave is just a huge bat guano deposit. And so actually there, it's very intense. Like the smell of it is really intense. And
that's where we discovered the acoustic qualities.
Right. And so there, we go into
to make manifest.
Exactly.
You
can hear that. You hear that buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs, and it's even better, heard because of this acoustic buffering of the bat guano. So we were fascinated with that sound, and we had, been thinking about it. And then this blackout happened in Puerto Rico, and then Maria happened, and we're like, we really want to make something with that. This just fascinated with it, and so we told David, like, we want to make something where involving human voices, because another long story which we don't have time for, but we've been walking for a long time with the human voice and have been doing a lot of work that pieces that involve the human voice and what that instrument is capable of. And we said we wanted to make a work for vocalists in which they respond to, or they tune their voices kind of to this transformer, and that we create the event of an electrical outage through this participation of this vocal ensemble. You're going to have at the Menil is going to be something that kind of suggests that. And I don't know if you can, I think if I can play this on my computer, I have a part of the recording that maybe we can hear a little bit of it so you can get a sense of, these are all human voices making these songs. It starts off like this.
Can you hear?
Can you hear it?
I think so.
And then later on, and then what happens is later on it then builds, the score builds into this beautiful crescendo where they're also, not only are they making these buzzing electrical sounds, but there's these other vowel sounds and consonant sounds that are layered in, and it creates this, again, this event, this musical event that in some way is parallel to an electrical explosion. So later on it sounds something like this. I'll leave it at that for now, but and the score is written in such a way that it's adaptable to as little as 2 or 3 people to any number of people can be involved in. Trained people can be part of this event, so it's very flexible. So it'll be very exciting when this event comes and takes over the Menil in the spring.
Yeah, I think.
So that was our sneak peek.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're out of time, so I will say this was a pleasure. And for those of you in the audience who want more of Jennifer and Guillermo, the good news is we're doing another In Dialogue program with them on December 8th, where we'll be in conversation with the great art historian Molly Nesbitt, who traveled with you to Martinique for this show, Roberto Tejada, and the director of the Aimé Césaire Foundation in Martinique. So I please come for that. I think it'll be a much deeper dive into Penumbra, the work of art with the shadows in particular that is in this exhibition. So thank you both again. We look forward to seeing you in Houston.
Us as well.
Right, absolutely.
I miss you so much. We worked together so long. We missed the fun part. It will come in the spring. And
to any of the audiences who we didn't get to answer you, hopefully when we're in Houston, we'll have the opportunity during the performances, look out for us and we'll happily answer your questions then.
We're planning to do a live talk with you both when you're back in the spring. So please do save your questions. We will collect them as well. And to conclude, I'll say thank you to everyone in the audience tonight. Thank you for supporting the Menil. Thank you to all our supporters of this exhibition. Thank you to David Lang, our composer who was in residence over the summer to make this really special in terms of the sound. Again, the exhibition will be up through summer solstice 2021, June 20th. And thank you so much, both of you. And we look forward to welcoming you, the audience, to the exhibition soon. Thank you.